The mysterious stone mask has existed since the distant past. The mask outlived the Aztec civilization and eventually made its way to Europe, and now into the lives of two young men, one a nobleman with a pure heart and the power of Shaman, and the other who claims the mask's power and becomes a vampire and the ruler of darkness. Bound by destiny, the two men compete in battle to the full extent of their intelligence, strength, and abilities. At the end of their battle, the two men will be cast into the deep blue sea. Amid the build-up to the Second Great War, the Pillarmen, who created the stone mass, awaken from their 2,000-year slumber. Through the power of the red stone, they seek to become the ultimate beings. The brave Shaman fighters appear before them and defeat the Pillarmen one by one. But the last Pillarman transforms into the ultimate being, no longer vulnerable to the sun and surpassing all other beings. The Shaman users and the ultimate being have their final showdown on an island, as the earth shakes beneath them. In the end, the heroes are victorious, and the ultimate being is expelled from Mother Earth. After 100 years, the ruler of evil awakens. Entwined with his destiny are 5 men, 4 young, and 1 old, and a dog. With the power of guardian spirits called stands, they overcome the obstacles in their way as they continue their journey and their battles. The struggle between good and evil goes on for roughly 50 days, and the mighty stands make any place their battlefield, even with frozen time. But in the end, victory smiles upon the forces of good, as the sun once again rises over a foreign land. I recently purchased the JoJo 6251 art book as I was browsing my local Barnes & Noble, and being the massive JoJo fan I am, had to purchase it without a second thought. One of the first things you see when opening this book is the quotes I read at the start, one for introducing us to Part 1, another for Part 2, and again for Part 3. I believe that these statements are the pinnacle example of how the relationship and dichotomy of the JoJo heroes and villains operate, which is specifically what I'm here to talk about. Welcome to the dichotomy dynamic, and in this series, I look at the relationship of protagonists and antagonists in a multiple of series, and in doing so, I will see how they relate and differ. This is one I've been excited to do. I'll be looking over the Joestar lineage versus Dio. Now, you might see this as cheating a bit, as I'm not picking one particular character to pit against Dio, but that's because, the way I see it, Dio affects all the Joestars, and pits a challenge against every single one of them, whether that is direct or indirectly. In the quote stated earlier, the description for Part 1's Phantom Blood reads, "Bound by Destiny." For those familiar with JoJo, you're quite aware of the concept of fate and destiny, and how it plays a massive role in nearly all JoJo parts. Before I get any further, I would like to clarify that I will be mainly talking about Parts 1 through 6, and while Parts 7 and 8 are incredible, they do take place in an alternate story. Because of that, they don't really have much of an influence on Dio, although he does play a role in Part 7. With that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. Now, the part of the quote saying, "bound by destiny," is really what caught my attention. One could make the argument that every event in JoJo has been bound by fate. Every event led to another, and without each particular act, the story would not be the way it is today. It all started back in the late 1870s when George Joestar and his wife, along with their baby, suffered in a carriage accident, leaving Miss Joestar dead. A man named Dario Brando discovers the accident, and as he believes everyone is dead, goes to loot the bodies. Yet, George survived, and was misled into thinking Dario was there to save them. As a form of gratitude, George owes his life to the man, which we all know would soon take place. From even the very beginning, the Joestars and Brandos were entwined. A span of family-long conflict that would not end until the early 2010s all started here. In Part 1, we have Jonathan Joestar as our main character, and many fans of the series are quick to point out that he is their least favorite of the JoJo cast. I was definitely a part of that mindset when I first watched the series, but I've gained a newfound respect for Jonathan. He's a young man who grows up with the notion of respect and masculinity being everything, for if he is not a gentleman, then what is he? Some may see this as a trope of its time, with many protagonists during the period in which Phantom Blood was written who were overly strong, heroic, and flawless heroes. But just because Jonathan has these traits doesn't make him a bad character. He isn't without flaws, actually. He witnesses his father dying in front of him, betrayed by his adopted brother, then failing to defeat him in their first battle, all while his home is burned to ashes. I wouldn't say Jonathan had it easy by any means. However, like most main characters, he does learn from this and trains to become stronger. When he encounters Dio in his castle, he isn't irrational, he isn't quick to throw spite or malice or hatred at him. He still respects him in a way and wants their battle to be one of honor and duality. Finally, even at the final encounter with Dio on the ship, we witness Jonathan's heroic nature come into play. After having his throat punctured, with Dio threatening to take over his body and destroy everything he's accomplished, what does Jonathan do? He holds Dio. He embraces his brother he had grown up with for nearly a decade and holds him one last time. Now tell me, can you say that any other JoJo would do such an action with their rival? One who had destroyed their home, family, and life? This is what makes Jonathan such an amazing character to me. Even in death, he wants Dio to feel some sense of longing and love, because he knows that Dio was never given that type of life he had. The two men may have been polar opposites, but Jonathan never gave up faith, even in death. And now we have Dio. Dio was a boy raised in a cruel upbringing that he had no control over. Raised in the slums of England by an alcoholic and abusive father who worked his own wife to death, Dio would have to resort to hatred and selfishness to survive. He indeed was a product of his environment, though, resorting to cheap tricks at bars and pubs for money and food, all while hassled by his father to treat his illness. Dio would start to hate and resent the world he lived in. I know many people believe Dio is simply evil incarnate. Hell, even Speedwagon claims this after seeing the marks on his ear, claiming it's the mark of a devilish person. But Dio really just had to adapt to the world he was raised in. Of course, his actions towards Jonathan and his family are terrible, and his goal of inheriting the Joestar fortune is truly selfish, but it's from the only perspective he's known. It's clear through Dio's actions at the Joestar estate during his time living there that he felt no pity or remorse for Jonathan, George, Erina, hell, even Danny. But I think we know why. Dio relishes in making Jonathan's life miserable, solely because he believes it'll push him away further from inheriting the sweet Joestar fortune. However, as the part progresses, and Jonathan and Dio meet once again on the cruiser, he has some level of respect for Jonathan. Whether this is due solely because he had defeated him previously in battle, or if Dio had always had some underlying respect that wasn't completely faked, is up for debate. What isn't, though, is to deny that Dio didn't feel a semblance of sadness, or at least shock, in Jonathan's death. I'm sure the last action Dio expected was for his brother to embrace him in death. After all, it was probably the first time, and only time, he was ever given love. When we get to part 2 of JoJo, Dio is nowhere to be seen, and we follow the ecstatic grandson of Jonathan, named Joseph Joestar. I'm not going to cover too much on this part, as firstly, Dio makes no appearance, but secondly, doesn't have much of an influence on this part regardless. However, that's not to say he has none at all. After all, Joseph would never have had Haman potential if it weren't for Jonathan's will and desire to defeat Dio, meaning he most likely would have failed to defeat the Pillar Men, let alone Straizo at the beginning of the part. However, it is because of Dio that Straizo seeks out vampiric immortality, leading him to trick Speedwagon into locating more of the mass, and inevitably, the Pillar Men. In a way, you could say that Dio had more influence on Straizo than any other character in this part. However, we as an audience are introduced to the Pillar Men, and their presence in the story is to give us more history of the Stone Mass, their origin, and the civilization that used them. Back in part 1, we were to believe that there was only one mask, and that had utterly been destroyed. Part 2, however, shows us that the masks are plentiful, and a power even more dangerous than Dio exists. Think about it. Part 1 saw Dio, a vampire created through the Stone Mask, as our main threat to power. That enough caused civilians to die, Haman warriors to fall, and our protagonists dead. Part 2, on the other hand, has our cast fighting off the creators of this power, all whilst fighting off regular zombies and vampires. Talk about an upgrade and a new villain. And while I do like Cars and the Pillar Men, they just don't hold a candle to the impactful and important nature of Dio. Speaking of which, brings us to part 3. After 100 years, Dio has risen from his watery grave and is back to make another big impression. I simply love Dio in Part 3, and while he actually doesn't have much screen time, he brings out a looming threat throughout the part. The entire main cast has been affected by Dio, either directly or indirectly again. Characters like Avdol, Kakyoin, and Polnareff have all first-handedly encountered Dio, to which an overwhelming sense of dread and terror filled in them. However, I would say Joseph and Jotaro have been much more affected by Dio than the others, even without ever having met him. It was due to Dio's awakening that caused the distress signal in Jonathan's body. It was due to his signal that Holly fell ill, and because Holly fell ill, that Dio must be killed. While I find Jotaro to be a great character and one of my favorite JoJos, I actually find Joseph to be the star of this part. He still retains his goofy manners from Part 2, but has matured, at least a little, and taken on the mentor and leader role of the group. He still has some comedic moments, but when things get serious, you can feel it from him. Take from the final battle in the Dio's World arc. After Iggy and Avdol were killed, along with Kakyoin, Dio wiped out half of our cast. We knew his threat was imminent, but the sudden death of 3 characters was alarming. Finally, after Joseph's throat was punctured and presumed dead, he gave Jotaro a final warning: to stay away from Dio at all costs. Pursuing him would be suicide and would only lead to Jotaro's death. This was coming from our leader, the man who set a course of 50 days to save his daughter, only to realize just how dire and futile the task seemed. Dio has had some true potential to be one of, if not, the scariest villain in all of JoJo. His presence, attitude, thoughts, and calm yet plotting nature are always somehow one step ahead and hidden in sight. While Dio still has his vampiric life form in him, his stand, the world, is truly terrifying. While I think the manga and 2012 anime do an amazing job at portraying the sound, style, and sheer power of the world, it's the 1997 OVA that brings out the horror of it. The battle between Jotaro and Dio is mainly devoid of music or sound effects, and as we see, Dio seemingly teleports from one spot to another, all from Jotaro's perspective. It instills an almost realistic depiction of just how quickly Dio could kill if he felt like it. When it comes to Jotaro, he's usually giving the cold shoulder to others, mainly in a rude or too cool for school attitude. However, this is far from the truth. Jotaro cares heavily for his friends and companions. While he's not like other shonen protagonists who would break down and cry, he harbors his emotions silently, quietly, and to himself. The news of Avdol and Iggy's death shows us Jotaro's feelings of loss, no matter how quiet he is in it. I mean, can you really blame Jotaro for being angry? He was thrown into a 100-year bloodline battle involving a great-great-grandfather of who he never knew and is now expected to defeat the same monster who caused all of this to happen. With the combined death of his friends, his mother's fate on the line, and the treacherous 50 days of battle, Jotaro ignores his grandfather's warnings to back off Dio, and using his anger to advantage, would finally end in Dio's defeat. And while Dio may have finally been beaten for good this time, his legacy would further cause the Joestar lineage to endure more suffering. In Part 4, we follow Josuke, our newest protagonist, to the town of Morio. The setting and structure of Part 4 are much less high stakes than Part 3, which some may like, while others may find the slice of life aspect boring. But to say there isn't a threat or looming problem in this part would be ignorant. This part actually sees a variety of mini-villains, who will be the focal point of interest for our characters throughout the early chapters of Part 4. One of these is Kaicho, Okuyasu's older brother. It's revealed to us that he has been creating stand users in an attempt for one to kill his father. We learn that his father was a servant of Dio, much like the many in Stardust Crusaders, and was implanted with the mind-controlling flesh blood. However, when Dio was killed, the flesh blood seemed to take complete hold over his body, turning him into some kind of amalgamation of a living monster. Even after years have passed since Dio's death, he still has a hold on others alive today, creating even more tragedy after death. With this part's main villain of Kira, we can even see a bit of resemblance of Dio, not just in the physical aspect, but even demeanor. Sure, Kira may not want to take over the world, in fact he wants quite the opposite, but he's a confident man when you first see him, and even more so when he gains bites to dust. He showboats when he wants to, and underestimates Jotaro and Josuke's powers, all while causing legitimate fear in those around him. But then we have Part 5's Golden Wind, which introduces us with a new take on a JoJo, the offspring of not a Joestar, but Dio himself, with Giorno taking up the mantle as our new protagonist. Giorno takes on the influence of both Dio and Jonathan, with his golden heart and resolve for making Italy a safe nation for everyone around it, yet also contrasted with Dio's violent and brutal nature, as most of the fights in this part usually end in death for the characters, along with just how brutal this part really gets. While I'm not a huge fan of Giorno, he's quite a nice contrast to Dio. The thing I do like about Giorno is that it shows us that even if you come from a lineage of evil, a family of mistreatment, you have the power to change. It was extremely possible for Giorno to turn out much like his father, one who doesn't care for human life and seeks out only power and pleasure. Like his father, Giorno was raised in a cruel household, with an absent mother and an abusive father role. And while Dio let his hatred for humanity and what it had done to him corrode him, Giorno sought for change. And a change happened. I do love the dynamic of Giorno and Diavolo, with each of their stands following the concept of fate. Diavolo is a man so bound with the fear of fate, he would develop a stand to counteract it, along with Giorno's golden experience, being one to create new life, to alter the world and outcomes. One was scared, while the other embraced it. Regardless, fate favors the bold and righteous at heart, which in turn allowed for Giorno to reign true over Italy through all of the hardships that came with it. Finally, we arrive at Part 6, Stone Ocean, a part that JoJo fans seem to be divided on. Contrary to what many would believe, I think Part 6 is brilliant. While it may have some of the weakest fights in all of JoJo history, it easily makes up for it with its grand epic finale and villain to accompany it, Enrico Pucci. A devout man sworn on his goal for humanity to ultimately be aware of their future actions and lives, resulting in true peace, or as he calls it, heaven. We follow Jolene Cujo, the final Joestar in our timeline. Being the first and only female Joestar, she easily stands out from previous incarnations. Not only that, but she is the daughter of one of the beloved and famous Jotaro Kujo. Being the next of the Joestar lineage, it would only be fitting for her to follow in the steps of her father, whether that be willing or unwillingly. Like her father, Jolene is thrust into a century-long feud of bloodshed between the forces of good and evil, Joestar and Brando, of which he has no involvement in, at least that she's aware. As for Pucci, Jolene is the key for heaven, or at least a stepping stone there. Much like Jotaro's teen years being taken away from him, forcing himself to battle a foe he has never met to save his mother, Jolene would take on an eerily similar fate. When given the chance of escaping Green Dolphin prison, she chooses to stay incarcerated, if it means saving her father's life and stopping the mysterious foe causing her family harm. Pucci on his own is a great villain, but of course, it wouldn't be JoJo without Dio, and we learn that Pucci is somewhat of an apprentice to Dio. Dio took up Pucci as just a young teen, and filled him to the brim with knowledge and philosophy on what heaven truly is, and the peace of mind he seeks. We see Dio as much more philosophical and introspective, as he has matured from his battle with Jonathan over a century ago. Once again, even in Dio's death, his legacy and torment reign over the Joestar line. Who could have expected that after dying twice, that this husk of a man could damage generations of family and friends? Did Jotaro, a boy who was kidnapped from his peaceful life, after watching his friends die, killing said monster, to then seeing the irreparable damage his death has caused, learning he had a son, to realizing your daughter was using a ploy to achieve his plan, ever expect this outcome? I'm gonna go with no. But like Jotaro, Jolene's brash and formidable personality wouldn't stop her from pursuing Pucci, and ultimately, Dio. And when the time came, she too would put her life on the line in stopping the enemy, if it meant allowing the greater good to commence. It wasn't only Jolene who would risk everything though, as the entire main cast of Part 6 are taken out by Pucci. Even as Jotaro comes to the rescue, his time stop is still no match. Or perhaps, maybe it could have been, that is, if he wasn't faced with the most crucial and important decision of his life. In a sudden moment, as Jotaro is just 1 second away from landing the finishing blow on Pucci, he notices the knives. Frozen in time, the same trick Dio used on him years ago, is inescapable. Jotaro is right there. He can stop Pucci and put an end to both him and Dio once and for all, but would he lose his daughter over this? What would you do in this situation? Would you even have time to react? You have mere seconds to decide, and Jotaro picks his daughter. However, he was still late by 2 steps. Pucci expected this after all, as he knew the Joestars' weaknesses, that being their pride and strength in their bloodline. Jotaro, along with his daughter, are killed by Pucci, all in protecting the next living member of the group. Anasui protected Jotaro, Jotaro to Jolyne, and Jolyne to Emporio. The parallels between Jotaro and Jolyne are magnificent, and I don't really think people give this part the credit it deserves on how well the characters are. Also, Pucci isn't just some one-to-one matchup of Dio. He stands well as a villain on his own. He's ruthless, determined, and will use anyone if it means he achieves heaven. In a way, it's almost respectable how much dedication Pucci has in reaching his goal. And even in death, Pucci pleads to Emporio just how important the heaven plan is, and was even willing to die after the cycle was complete, going to show that, over everything, even his own life, Pucci was determined to aspire goals set in by Dio. And that's the entire JoJo's universe, besides parts 7 through 9, but Dio isn't in that. At least not the same Dio we had in parts 1 through 6. As much as I love Diego Brando, he wouldn't really fit into the analysis because he just simply isn't Dio. While he has many similar characteristics and traits of Dio, they just aren't the same person. Don't get me wrong, I freaking love Diego Brando. He's one of my favorite characters in all of Steel Ball Run, but let's be honest, Steel Ball Run is probably the best JoJo part by far. And if you made it to the end of this video, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm trying to get back into doing more videos. I've just been busy with school and other things happening in life, but I really do enjoy making videos. And let me know if you want to keep seeing more of this dichotomy dynamic video with protagonists and antagonists. It's a lot of fun to do. But just like I said before, thank you for watching, and I hope I can see you again soon.